They say you can live a lifetime in the space between a single heartbeat and the next. That one moment, a man can be a king in his own mind, the architect of a perfect future, and in the next, he is a supplicant at the feet of a world he never knew existed. This is the story of a man who spent 20 years building a bride out of dreams and memory, only to have her walk into his life and burn the whole blueprint to the ground. It is a tale of expectations, of the quiet desperation of a solitary life, and of the unexpected, terrifying, and beautiful grace that comes when reality refuses to conform to our fantasies. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the better part of 20 years I have lived in a world measured in the width of a pine needle and the depth of a winter's snow. I came to this valley in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains as a young man, filled with a romantic notion of self-sufficiency, a Thoreau for the Rockies. I had a pocket full of gold dust and a head full of dreams, and I carved out a small piece of the earth for myself. A cabin, a spring, a few acres of stubborn soil that I coaxed into providing potatoes and turnips. I traded my soul for solitude, piece by piece, for the quiet rhythm of the axe and the silence of the pines. I wasn't always a hermit. I grew up in a clapboard house in a town that smelled of sawdust and horse manure, a place where the women wore their Sunday best to go to the general store, and the men spoke in the clipped, practical tones of farmers. My mother was a woman of soft hands and a softer heart, who read me stories by the firelight until my eyes grew heavy. She spoke of princesses and brave knights, of far-off lands where love was a grand, sweeping gesture. She painted a picture of my future bride, a girl with laughter like wind chimes and hair the color of spun gold. I was a boy who believed in the pictures painted for him. I believed in a love that was a perfect, symmetrical thing, a happy ending written in the stars. But life has a habit of smudging the ink on our happy endings. A fever took my mother when I was 17, and the light in our home flickered out. My father, a stoic man who measured his love in acts of provision, retreated further into his silence. The story stopped. The future I had been promised seemed to have died with my mother. I felt an emptiness in my chest that the town's practicalities couldn't fill. The sawdust and the manure suddenly smelled of a life I didn't want. I started to see the mountains in my dreams, not just as a distant blue line on the horizon, but as a sanctuary, a place where I could rewrite the story, where I could build a world that couldn't be taken from me. So I left. I packed my few belongings, said a gruff goodbye to my father, and walked into the wilderness. It was an act of heartbreak as much as it was an act of ambition. I was running from a world that had failed to deliver its promises, running towards a world I could control. And control it I did. I learned the language of the forest, the whisper of the wind in the pines, the gurgle of the creek that was my only conversation, the sharp bark of a squirrel that served as my alarm clock. I became an expert in the textures of my own life, the smooth grain of a whittled wooden spoon, the coarse weave of a woolen blanket, the unforgiving hardness of a hand-hewn log. The solitude was a balm, then a fortress, then a prison of my own making. But even in the deepest solitude, a man's mind doesn't stop. It finds things to do. It begins to build. In the beginning, it was just an echo of my mother's stories, a fleeting image in the firelight. But as the years passed, the image solidified. She became my constant companion, a phantom bride I built with the meticulous care of a master craftsman. She was everything I had been told a woman should be. Soft, gentle, fair-haired, with a voice like water over smooth stones, and a smile that could melt the frost on a window pane. I spent countless nights by my fire, the whittling knife still in my hand, my mind far away. I would build her a house in my head, a vast improvement over my own humble cabin. It would have a proper hearth, a kitchen window with a view of the meadow, and a porch where we would sit and watch the sunset. Her name, I decided, was Grace. It had a softness, a piety to it. She was a girl who had grown up in a neat white farmhouse, surrounded by apple trees and the scent of fresh-baked bread. Her hands were soft and uncalloused, her laugh a gentle melody. She had a simple faith, a quiet strength, an unwavering belief in the goodness of the world. She was the perfect antidote to the harsh reality I had chosen. I imagined our first meeting 1,000 times. I would be coming into town for supplies, a rare venture from my mountain. I would be dusty and tired, my clothes patched and worn. She would see me, not as a dirty prospector, but as a man of the wild, a romantic figure. Her father, a kindly pastor, would invite me to supper. I would be awkward and quiet, but my innate goodness would shine through. She would see the soul behind the rough exterior. We would talk for hours, our souls connecting on a level that transcended the mundane. I would return to my mountain, and she would write me letters, long, beautiful letters that I would read and reread by the fire. They would be filled with tenderness, with longing, with a shared vision of a life together. I imagined our life together with the same vivid detail. She would soften the harsh edges of my existence. She would plant a garden, a riot of color against the green. The cabin would be filled with the scent of her cooking, the sound of her humming. We would grow old together, our hands intertwined, our hearts full. I saw her in the glint of the morning light on the frost, in the soft curve of a snowdrift, in the pure white of a winter bloom. She was the answer to a prayer I had stopped believing in. She was the living embodiment of the promise my mother had whispered to me on those cold winter nights. This phantom bride was my shield against the loneliness. She was the balm for my weary soul. She was the reason I got up in the morning, the reason I kept the cabin warm and the fire stoked. She was the future I was working towards. The stockpile of furs by the door wasn't just for trade. It was for her, to keep her warm in the brutal Montana winters. The clearing I was widening by the creek wasn't just for better sunlight. It was for the garden she would plant. Everything I did, every hardship I endured, was a brick in the grand cathedral of my imagined life. She was the sun around which my entire existence orbited, a celestial body so bright I could no longer see the stars. But the fire provides a harsh light, and in its flickering glow, I could sometimes see the cracks in my carefully constructed fantasy. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled like a wounded wolf and the snow piled high against the door, the silence would become a physical presence. It would press in on me, suffocating. My dream wife, with her gentle smile, would feel less like a comfort and more like a mockery. The whispered conversations I held with her would echo in the empty room, a hollow sound. I would look at my hands, scarred and calloused from years of work, and I would wonder what a soft, fair-haired creature like her would think of them. Would she recoil from my touch? Would she be frightened by my strangeness? The doubt would creep in, insidious and cold. In these moments I would build her flaws. Perhaps she was too meek. Perhaps she would wilt under the hardships of mountain life. I imagined her crying, overwhelmed by the isolation, begging me to take her back to the town. I would see a flash of my mother's eyes in the firelight, the fever draining the life from them, and the fear would be a knot of ice in my gut. The imagined happiness would curdle into a preemptive grief. I was so afraid of losing her, this woman who didn't exist, that I would almost push her away. I would purposefully create arguments in my head, watching her retreat from me in a swirl of imagined hurt. It was a sickness, a fever of the mind. This pattern of fantasy and fear was the rhythm of my life. The seasons bled into one another. The summers were for work and the winters were for dreaming. The years piled up like snowdrifts. I was no longer a young man. The furrows in my brow were permanent now, and the hair around my temples had turned to gray. I had become the very thing I had sought to escape, a relic, a man out of time. The world was changing, I knew. I would occasionally hear whispers in town of new technologies, of a war in a place called Cuba, of a railroad that was stitching the country together. But it all felt like a story from a distant land, a tale that had no bearing on my life. My life was here, in my valley, with my phantom bride. Then one year it happened, a dry summer, followed by a brutal winter. The deer were scarce. My traps yielded little. My small garden, my pride and joy, was decimated by a late frost. I was running low on everything: flour, salt, coffee. The cabin felt colder than it ever had before. My body, no longer young, ached with a bone-deep weariness. I was faced with a simple, brutal equation. I had to go to town, a place I had been actively avoiding for nearly 2 decades. My heart, a muscle rusty from disuse, pounded with a strange, unfamiliar dread. The very thought of the town, of its noise and its people, was a violation of my carefully controlled world. But the ache in my belly was more persuasive than the fear in my mind. I gathered my few remaining goods, a handful of pelts of poor quality, and I started the long, arduous journey down the mountain. The town, a place called Stillwater, was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps it was just my perception that had changed. The clapboard houses looked shabbier, the people who walked the dirt streets seemed pale and ill-defined. I felt like a ghost, walking through a world that belonged to the living. I couldn't make eye contact. My hands, gripping my bundle of furs, felt as clumsy and oversized as a child. I found my way to the Mercantile, a dusty shop run by a weasel of a man named Finch. He gave me a pittance for my pelts, his eyes flickering over my ragged clothes with barely concealed disdain. I felt a hot flush of shame. The proud mountain man, the king of his own domain, reduced to a beggar in a general store. I took the meager coins and bought the things I absolutely needed: salt, coffee, a sack of flour. I was about to leave, my business done, my mission accomplished. And that's when I saw her. It was a moment so ordinary, so unremarkable that I almost missed it. A girl, no, a woman, was standing by the counter sorting through a box of ribbons. She was dressed simply in a plain, dark dress. Her hair, pulled back from her face, was the color of dark honey, not spun gold. It looked strong and unruly, as if it was trying to escape its confines. She was tall, not small and delicate. Her hands, as I would later notice, were not soft. They were slender but capable-looking, with dirt under the nails and a small scar on her thumb. She didn't laugh like wind chimes. When she laughed, it was a deep, full-bellied sound that startled me. It was a laugh that came from a place of unapologetic joy, a sound so utterly unexpected in the muted world of the Mercantile that I flinched. A man I didn't know had said something to her, a private joke, and she had thrown her head back and laughed. It was a single, earth-shattering moment. The architecture of my imagination, the great cathedral I had built in my mind over 20 years, began to crumble. The phantom bride I had constructed, the perfect, gentle, golden-haired Grace, was completely, utterly, and irrevocably erased. She was a ghost, and in her place stood a living, breathing woman who was nothing like her, and everything I had never known I needed. The world tilted on its axis. The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid. I had imagined my future bride 100 times, but reality was, in that instant, far more surprising. My first thought was that I was having an episode, a deprivation of the mind, a trick of the light. I blinked hard, expecting the vision to dissolve. But the woman with the honey-colored hair and the unladyled laugh remained, her fingers now running over a length of plain, sturdy cotton. She was examining it with the same intense focus a prospector gives a promising vein of ore. A pair of scissors, small and sharp, hung from a cord around her waist. She was an artisan, I realized with a start. A woman with a purpose. Elias Thorne. Finch's voice was an unwelcome intrusion, dragging me back to the dusty reality of his shop. He was holding out my change, a few coins on his grimy palm. His eyes were sharp, watching me, assessing my flustered state. I mumbled my thanks and scooped the coins into my pocket, my attention already fleeing back to the woman. But she was gone. The spot by the counter where she had stood was empty, and I felt a pang of loss so acute it stole my breath. I had seen my future, and it had vanished in a whirl of dark fabric and uncontrollable laughter. I stumbled out of the Mercantile, my meager supplies clutched to my chest like a shield. The sun was too bright, the town too loud. I felt raw, exposed, as if my skin had been flayed off. The world I had so carefully constructed, the one where I was in control, was gone. In its place was a terrifying, exhilarating chaos. A woman I didn't know had shaken the foundations of my entire life with a single laugh. I found a bench on the boardwalk and sank onto it, my legs suddenly unable to hold my weight. I tried to piece her together. Dark honey hair, unruly and strong, tall with good shoulders and a capable bearing, a laugh that was a full-bellied, joyful sound. I had imagined soft, delicate hands. She had hands with dirt under the nails and a scar on her thumb. The dissonance was jarring, but it was a truth I couldn't shake. The fantasy was a lie, but this woman, this stranger, was real. And the realness of her was intoxicating. My reverie was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. A young boy, no more than 10, with a shock of red hair, was running towards the bench. He was clutching a small, rolled-up bundle of paper. He skidded to a halt in front of me, his eyes wide and serious. "Are you Elias Thorne?" I nodded, too stunned to speak. He thrust the paper into my hand. "A lady said to give this to you, said you'd be by the bench." Before I could ask any questions, he darted away, disappearing into the flow of people on the street. With trembling hands, I unrolled the paper. It was a simple note, written in a clear, bold hand that was nothing like the delicate, ornate script I had imagined from my phantom bride. It read, "Mr. Thorne, I saw you watching me in Finch's. You looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. I don't know you, but I have a feeling we need to talk. I'm staying at the boarding house on the edge of town, the one with the peeling blue paint. Come find me before you disappear back into your mountains. The world needs more men who look like they just saw a ghost. Sincerely, Clara Vance." Clara, not Grace, a strong, solid name. The note was just as surprising as the woman herself. It was direct, unapologetic, and challenging. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. I felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost knocked me over. Fear, excitement, a strange, budding hope. I had spent 20 years building a woman who would be gentle and demure, who would defer to my world, my wishes, my version of the story. Clara Vance was the opposite of everything I had imagined, and the note in my hand was proof that she was bold, perceptive, and completely unafraid. I did the only thing I could do. I went to find her. The boarding house with the peeling blue paint was easy to find. It was a modest 2-story building, the paint faded and blistered by the sun. The woman who answered the door was older, a widow from the look of her, with kind eyes and flour on her apron. I mumbled my request, the words feeling clumsy and foreign on my tongue. She led me to a small sitting room at the back of the house, furnished with worn furniture and a silent, dusty piano. And then she left me there, alone, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was packing, my hands clenched into fists when she walked in. She had changed her dress. She was now wearing a simple but well-made blouse of a soft, sage green. The color made her hair look even richer. She held a sewing basket in one hand, and on her fingers I could see small leather thimbles protecting her needle-pricked fingertips. This was not a woman of idle leisure. This was a woman of work. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a calm, measured contralto. No breathless anticipation, no swooning, just a simple, direct acknowledgement. "I'm glad you came." Her directness disarmed me. All the carefully rehearsed lines I had been preparing in my head, the ones I had practiced for my imaginary Grace, evaporated. I was left with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth. "You're not what I imagined," I blurted out, the words escaping before I could stop them. She didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spread across her face, and it was that smile that did it. It wasn't a delicate, demure smile. It was a smile of fierce intelligence and amusement. It was the smile of a woman who has just won a hand of poker. "I know," she said simply. "I never am. That's why I had the boy give you the note. Most men can't reconcile what they see with what they expected, but you looked like you were ready for a reckoning." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit. You look like you're about to bolt." I said, my legs obeying her command even as my mind was screaming at me to flee. This woman had seen right through me. She had seen the ghost of my fantasy, and she had challenged it. In the span of a few minutes, she had dismantled my world and invited me to help her build a new one. "I'm a seamstress," she said, placing her sewing basket on the small table beside her. "I travel from town to town, picking up work from the local merchants and the wealthier families. I mend, I stitch, I make. I'm very good at it. People are always surprised by that. a traveling woman, an unmarried seamstress, but I'm a survivor. I've made my own way in this world. I've had to. She was telling me her life story, laying it out with a matter-of-factness that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She told me of a father who drank, a mother who died young, an early marriage to a man who promised her the world and delivered only hardship. He had died in a mining accident, leaving her nothing but debt and a small skill with a needle. She had taken that skill and turned it into a life. "This life," she said, gesturing to the room around her, "it's not the one I dreamed of, but it's mine. I've learned the names of the trees, the patterns of the seasons, the colors of the soil. I don't know a single thing about your mountains, Mr. Thorne, but I know the rhythm of the earth. I know what it's like to be alone in a world that doesn't have a place for you. And I think," she paused, her piercing brown eyes holding mine with an unwavering intensity, "that you know it too." At that moment, the phantom bride I had so carefully constructed was gone, not just altered but utterly obliterated. In her place was a woman with dirt on her hands and a scar on her thumb, a woman who sewed for a living and told her life story to a stranger. She was not soft. She was not gentle. She was a force of nature, as wild and untamed as the wind. She was a person who had faced the world and had the scars to prove it. And in her eyes I saw a reflection of my own loneliness, my own struggle. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a man alone. I felt like I had finally found a partner. Our conversation continued for hours. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the world in shades of deep blue and purple. The widow brought us cups of weak tea and a plate of stale biscuits. We didn't notice. We talked of our hopes and our fears, our disappointments and our small, personal victories. I told her of my mother, of the stories she used to tell me. She told me of the first dress she ever made for a client, a beautiful thing of lavender silk that had been paid for with a stolen bolt of cloth. We talked about the mountains, about the light on the snow in the mornings, about the smell of the pine resin and the damp earth after the rain. In a single afternoon, I had shared more of myself with this woman than I had with anyone in my entire adult life. "Your mountain sounds like a beautiful place," she said, her voice soft in the growing darkness. "But it sounds like a lonely place, too." She looked at me then, her eyes glistening with an unspoken question. "Is it enough to live a life that is only for yourself?" The question was a lance through my chest. Was it enough? It hadn't been, it had never been. My life had been a holding pattern, a waiting game. I had been building a house for a ghost. The answer was clear, stark, and terrifying. "No," I whispered, "it's not." The silence that followed was not a hollow, empty one. It was a silence of shared understanding. A silence of two souls, alone in the wilderness, finding an oasis in each other. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were calloused from her work, but they were surprisingly warm. A simple gesture, but to me it was a world-shaking act of intimacy. I had imagined my future bride 100 times, a woman who would be fragile and need my protection. I had imagined the weight of my hand in hers, but the reality of Clara Vance's hand, strong and capable and warm in my own, was far more surprising. It was a gift. It was a promise. It was a revolution. "Come back tomorrow," she said, a soft, almost command. "We're not finished talking." I nodded, unable to speak. I rose from my chair, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I walked to the door, my hand on the worn wooden frame. I turned to look at her one last time. She was silhouetted against the window, the last of the twilight outlining her determined profile. She was a woman made of shadow and light, of strength and vulnerability. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The woman I had imagined was a pale, watery reflection of the real woman who now sat before me. I left the boarding house into a world that had been completely, irrevocably changed. I had imagined a future bride 100 times, but reality had just handed me a gift I could never have conceived of in my wildest dreams. It was terrifying, and it was wonderful. And for the first time in 20 years, I was truly, deeply, and completely alive. The next morning I was up before the sun, a feeling of restless energy coursing through me that I hadn't felt since I was a boy. The familiar tasks of my mountain life felt alien. The woodpile held no interest. The traps were a distant chore. My mind was consumed by a single, brilliant, terrifying image, Clara Vance. I went to her. I was a moth drawn to a flame, and I didn't care if I got burned. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't return to my mountain. I rented a room in the boarding house, a small, dusty space that smelled of lavender and mothballs. It was the first time I had slept in a bed that wasn't my own in nearly 2 decades. I was a fish out of water, a stranger in a familiar land, but I didn't care. My entire existence had narrowed to the hours I spent with Clara. We talked in the small sitting room, in the boarding house garden when the weather was fine, and on long walks along the edges of town where the prairie met the mountains. We shared a common love for the land, for the small, beautiful things. A bird's song at dusk, the way the clouds gathered over the peaks before a storm. She saw things I had never noticed in my own mountain, and she showed them to me with the patient eye of a true artist. She also challenged me. She was unafraid of the silence, but she was even less afraid of the truth. She would look at me with those piercing, intelligent eyes and ask questions that made my soul squirm. She asked about my father, the man I had left behind. She asked about the friends I didn't have. She asked why I had built my life around a woman I had never met. It was like being interrogated by my own conscience. "You built a cage, Elias," she said one evening, her fingers nimbly repairing a tear in my only good shirt. "A beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. You've locked yourself away for so long, you've forgotten that the whole world is on the other side of the bars." She was right. My carefully constructed world, my sanctuary of solitude, was just a prison. The phantom bride was my warden. I had spent 2 decades in solitary confinement, but the key, I realized, was in my own pocket. And Clara Vance, this unexpected, infuriating, magnificent woman, was holding the door open. "What do you want out of a life?" I finally asked her one night. The question felt clumsy, inadequate. I had spent years imagining a bride who would simply be the answer to that question. Clara was forcing me to articulate it, to give it a shape that wasn't just a fairy tale. She stopped her sewing and considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I want a life that matters," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to wake up in the morning and know that the work I do has purpose. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself. I don't need a man to keep me safe, Elias. I need a man to keep me company." She looked at me, her eyes holding a challenge. "I need a partner." Those words echoed in the empty, silent cathedral of my heart. A partner, not a princess, not a damsel, a fellow traveler on the long, winding road of life. The weight of my own inadequacy settled on my shoulders. I was a man who had spent 2 decades alone. How could I possibly be a partner to anyone? I had no practice in the small, everyday acts of kindness that make a relationship work. I was a creature of solitude, a man who had forgotten how to be part of a we. But Clara, with her infinite patience and her unwavering belief in me, was teaching me. She taught me how to listen. She taught me how to ask questions. She taught me that sharing a meal was more than just consuming sustenance. It was an act of communion. She taught me that the silence between words could be a language of its own, a place of understanding and comfort. She was chipping away at the walls I had built, piece by piece, and the light was streaming in. The small, personal moments were what shattered my old world and forged a new one. There was the time I clumsily tried to help her wind a skein of wool, my big, clumsy fingers getting hopelessly tangled. She didn't scold me. She just laughed her deep, full-bellied laugh and patiently unraveled the mess I had made. Her hands, as they worked, brushed against mine. It was a tiny, insignificant gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was the touch of a real person, a solid, tangible being, and it was 1,000 times more powerful than any of my imaginary embraces. I started to see the small, specific, personal details that made her who she was. The way she would bite her lower lip in concentration when she was threading a needle. The way she would hum a soft, tuneless song when she was happy. The way she would gently scold me for tracking mud into the boarding house. She was a woman of habits, of routines, of a deep and abiding humanity. The Phantom Bride had been a collection of grand, sweeping ideals. Clara was a mosaic of small, beautiful, and sometimes infuriating realities. My feelings for her grew deeper with each passing day. It was a love that was rooted not in fantasy, but in a profound respect and admiration. I admired her strength, her independence, her refusal to be defined by the narrow expectations of her time. I cherished her intelligence, her wit, her gentle but unwavering insistence on the truth. I had dreamed of a woman who would complete me. I had found a woman who challenged me to complete myself. The truth of my situation became unavoidable. I was staying in a rented room in a town I had once despised, spending my days with a woman who had turned my world inside out. I had no plan. I had no money. I had only a crumbling mountain cabin and a heart that was being rebuilt. One evening I was packing the small room, my mind churning with a chaotic mix of hope and fear. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear her come in until she was standing in the doorway. "You're going to wear a groove in the floorboards," she said, her voice laced with a gentle teasing. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I stopped packing and looked at her. She was so real, so utterly present in that moment. A woman of flesh and blood. A woman of strength and vulnerability. The dam of my carefully held emotions finally burst. I crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her hands in mine. "Clara," I began, my voice cracking with emotion. "I'm a foolish, stubborn man who has spent the best years of his life hiding from the world. I built a dream out of loneliness and fear. I dreamed of a woman who was nothing more than a wish, a phantom to keep me company in the dark. But you are not a dream. You are a truth. You are a fire, a storm, a revolution. I don't know how to be a partner. I don't know how to share my life. I don't even know if I can, but I want to learn." I swallowed, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "I want to learn with you. Clara Vance, will you be my bride? Will you come to my mountain with all its hardships and loneliness and help me turn it into a home?" The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In my fantasy, Grace would have wept with joy. She would have thrown her arms around my neck and whispered her love. But Clara, my Clara, was not Grace. Her eyes, which had been so soft moments before, hardened. A flash of hurt and anger flickered across her face. She pulled her hands from mine and stepped back. "Your bride," she repeated, her voice icily calm. "You want me to be your bride, like a piece of property you've decided to acquire." "No, that's not what I stammered. "You spent 20 years imagining a future bride, a woman who was soft and compliant. A woman who would happily abandon her own life to live in your shadow, to tend your garden and warm your bed. And now, you're asking me to be that woman, to step into the mold you carved for a ghost." "Clara, please, you're not understanding," I pleaded, my heart sinking. "I was a fool, I was a child. The woman I imagined was nothing. You are everything. I am not asking you to be my fantasy. I am asking you to be my partner. I am asking you to be you." "Are you," she challenged, her voice raw, "or are you just replacing one fantasy with another? I will not be a symbol, Elias. I have spent my entire life being defined by other people's expectations. I will not be a seamstress, a lady, a wife. I will not be a placeholder for your lonely heart." She took a shuddering breath. "I will be a partner or I will be nothing. Can you accept that? Can you accept me for who I am and not who you want me to be?" This was the greatest test of my life. The easy answer, the one that would have preserved my fantasy, was to offer her the world on a platter, to promise her anything to make her stay. But I knew in my heart that this was the moment I had to prove I had truly changed. My entire life had been an attempt to control the world around me, to make it conform to my expectations. With my phantom bride, I had been the architect, but Clara was asking me to be a co-builder, a partner. "Yes," I said, the word a single, powerful note of truth. "I can accept you for who you are. I want a partner, Clara, I want you." And then, for the first time in my life, I did something I had never done in my entire adult existence. I let go of my control. I dropped to my knees in front of her. It was an act of utter vulnerability, of complete surrender. I looked up at her, my eyes pleading. "I am a fool," I said, my voice raw. I have been a fool for 20 years. I know that I have nothing to offer you but a lonely mountain and a heart that is still learning how to love. But I am offering it to you, all of it, the broken pieces, the fears, the hopes. I am offering you my life, not as a fantasy, but as a reality. Will you help me build a real one? For a long moment she was still. Then, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. It was not the smile of a woman who had just been given a ring. It was the smile of a woman who had just won the most important battle of her life. She reached out and placed her hand on my cheek, her calloused fingers gentle against my skin. "Yes, Elias," she whispered. "Yes, I will be your partner. I will help you turn your mountain into a home, but I will not be your bride, I will be your equal, I will be your wife." The journey back to my mountain was a strange and wonderful pilgrimage. The familiar trail which I had walked alone 100 times felt different now. The silence was not a void, it was a canvas. The solitude was not a loneliness, it was a sanctuary. And by my side was a woman who made the whole world new. Clara, true to her word, was a partner. She didn't just see the mountain as a beautiful landscape. She saw it as a place that could be made into a home. She looked at my cabin with a critical eye and immediately began a campaign of improvements. She didn't just accept my drafty, one-room home. She saw its potential. We worked side by side, an unlikely team of a mountain man and a traveling seamstress. She showed me how to make the cabin more efficient, how to patch the roof with a better mix of moss and clay. She taught me that a clean home wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for the spirit. She scrubbed the soot from the fireplace, hung dried wildflowers from the rafters, and sewed thick, warm curtains that kept the winter drafts at bay. The changes were small, but they were transformative. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a home. Her own work as a seamstress provided a lifeline to the outside world. She would take on mending jobs from the few settlers who lived nearby, trading her skill for flour, salt, and news of the wider world. The small piece of the mountain I had carved out for myself began to thrive. My garden, which I had neglected in my old age, flourished under her patient care. She planted vegetables in neat, orderly rows and flowers that had no practical purpose but to add a splash of color and joy. She was weaving a fabric of life, thread by thread, into the harsh tapestry of my world. The moments of true partnership were the ones that meant the most. In the long, dark winter nights, she would teach me to read, using an old, worn-out Bible her mother had given her. My hands, more accustomed to an axe and a rifle, felt clumsy turning the brittle pages. But Clara was patient. She would guide my finger along the words, her voice a low, soothing murmur in the flickering firelight. I learned to read the stories of Ruth and Naomi, of loyalty and devotion, and for the first time they felt real to me. They were stories about love, not the grand, sweeping love of fairy tales, but the small, hard-won, day-to-day love of two people who choose to stand together against the world. Our love, too, was a thing of small, resilient beauty. It was in the way she would bring me a cup of hot coffee in the morning, a simple gesture that spoke of a lifetime of commitment. It was in the way I would gather the best of the firewood for her, ensuring she was warm. It was in the quiet conversations we had by the fire, where we shared our deepest fears, our most private hopes. We built a life not on grand gestures, but on 1,000 tiny, unremarkable acts of kindness. It was more than I had ever dreamed of. But the path, as I had learned, was never a simple straight line. A new kind of loneliness crept in, one I hadn't anticipated. I had spent my whole life living in a world that existed only in my head. Now that I was living in the real world with a real woman, the ghosts of my imagination would sometimes come back to haunt me. There were nights when the old dreams would resurface. I would be lying in the warmth of our cabin, Clara sleeping peacefully beside me, and I would find myself staring into the darkness, comparing her to the phantom bride I had left behind. The phantom would be soft and silent. Clara snored, a soft, rhythmic sound that was both endearing and annoying. The phantom would have been a picture of serene contentment. Clara was a hurricane of opinions, a woman who would argue with me over the price of a sack of flour. I wrestled with a quiet, shameful sense of loss. For 20 years I had lived in a world I controlled absolutely. Now I had to navigate the messy, unpredictable reality of compromise. I had to consider another person's feelings, their needs, their desires. It was terrifying, and it made me doubt everything I had believed about myself. I had thought I was a man of strength, but living with Clara, I felt like a child, fumbling in the dark. One night the feeling of dislocation was so strong that I got up from the bed and went to sit by the fire. I stared into the flames, feeling the familiar pull of my old, self-destructive patterns. I started to build a new fantasy in my head, one where I was alone again, where the silence was absolute, where I could be the master of my own fate. It was a seductive thought, a siren's call to my most basic instincts. Clara must have sensed my absence. I heard her soft footfalls on the floorboards as she came to stand beside me. She didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on my shoulder and stood with me, her presence a quiet, solid weight in the darkness. "You're thinking about the phantom," she said, her voice soft, not an accusation but a statement of fact. I didn't deny it. I couldn't lie to her, not anymore. "I know," she said. "I think about her too sometimes. She was easier than me, quieter, more agreeable." There was a hint of a sad smile in her voice. "But she wasn't real, Elias, and she couldn't love you back. She couldn't hold your hand. She couldn't argue with you. She couldn't see you for who you really are." She was right. The phantom was a reflection of my own loneliness. Clara was a reflection of the truth. In that moment, the final vestiges of my fantasy disintegrated. The weight I had been carrying, the impossible burden of a perfect, impossible love, was gone. In its place was the simple, terrifying, and beautiful reality of a woman who loved me despite my flaws, who saw my ghosts and didn't run away. I reached up and took her hand, pulling her into my lap. She came willingly, her head resting against my chest. We sat like that for a long time, watching the fire die down. We didn't need words. The silence had become our language. The morning after that night, I woke to the sounds of her humming as she made coffee. A new feeling settled over me. It wasn't just the peace of a quiet morning. It was the profound, bone-deep satisfaction of a man who had finally found his place. I had imagined my future bride 100 times, a woman of fantasy and grace. But the reality, the woman now humming in my kitchen, was a woman of action, resilience, and an unflinching love. My life was no longer a series of lonely days and imagined futures. It was a shared story, a tapestry woven from the threads of our two lives. When the first real test came, we faced it not as two separate people but as a unit. The winter of 1899 was the most brutal I had ever seen. The snow piled high, the cold was a merciless living thing, and our supplies were dangerously low. The doubts and fears that had haunted me in my solitary years threatened to return, whispering that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had brought a woman into a world she couldn't survive. They were the same old ghosts, dressed in new clothes. But I was no longer the man who would have listened. I remembered what we were building. I remembered that we were partners. I looked at Clara, my partner, my wife, who was mending a tear in one of our few blankets, her expression one of quiet focus. She was not a damsel to be saved. She was a woman to be stood beside. We rationed our food, we shared the burden of the work, and we kept our spirits alive through the stories we told and the love we held. We survived. Not because I was strong, but because we were together. In the spring, when the first flowers pushed up through the melting snow, we planted our garden together. It was a small act, but it was a testament. We were no longer just surviving. We were planning for the future. And as I looked at Clara, her hands deep in the rich, dark soil, her face upturned to the sun, a truth settled over me with the weight and comfort of a well-worn coat. I had once imagined a future bride who was gentle, soft, and fair. But the reality of my wife, a woman of strength and resilience, a woman who had walked out of the wilderness of her own life to stand by my side, was a truth far more surprising and infinitely more precious. I had been so afraid of being alone that I had built a world of illusions. But I had finally found a real world, a world of dirt and laughter and love, and it was better than any dream I had ever dreamed. I had learned that the most beautiful things in life are the ones you never saw coming.